What's going on, guys? Super Savage 799 here, bringing you guys a video. Today we're doing more of Ericson boarding schools in season 1. So obviously we'll need to engineer a situation for the school to appear in season 1 without completely derailing the story. I originally was going to have the season 1 gang head towards the school, but that would be boring, as well as it would change way too much in an uninteresting way. So instead of moving the characters to the school, I decided to move the school to the characters. So in this timeline, the school and the motel will switch places. We'll start the story off in episode 1, with Glenn agreeing to head out to the nearby boarding school on a supply run. It's unlikely that there will be anyone there, and if there are any walkers, it will likely only be kids anyway. Glenn can easily take them in a fight if push comes to shove. Glenn would show up and would get inside through the front gate. He'd scope the area out before trying to enter the premises. As he goes to get inside, an arrow is fired at him. It is, however, a horrible shot, landing over 3 meters away from him. It is enough to get Glenn's attention, though. He'd be greeted by a woman who'd have a few children behind her, one of which is wielding a bow. This would be Miss Martin, with a young Lewis, Violet, and Marlin with her. She asks Glenn if he's come here for trouble, and of course he says no, explaining the situation about how he's with a small group and was looking for supplies. Glenn would explain about how they're stationed in a pharmacy, and Miss Martin asks about medical supplies. The school had some, but definitely not enough to sustain over 40 children. Maybe they can set up some sort of trade since they have lots of food. While Glenn would want to say yes, he knows he can't immediately agree on behalf of the group, and so he'd radio back to the gang. Lee and Carly show up to the school where they'd be able to look around. They ultimately find where Glenn and Miss Martin are, and the situation is explained. After some dialogue, Lee would get the option to agree with the trade or say that they don't have a deal. If he doesn't agree, then Carly will say that they need supplies, as would Glenn, and they make the deal anyway, because this is Telltale, your choices don't matter. I imagine Lee would equip himself with a bow, so he can deal with walkers, which would replace the axe he gets in canon. It means he uses a bow and arrow when having to kill his brother's walker. When heading inside the actual pharmaceutical area, Glenn, Carly, and Doug would also be there alongside Lee and Lily. The alarm would still go off, with the gang having to frantically get as many medical supplies as possible in a short time, similar to the drugstore trip Kenny and Leo go on in episode 3. After getting as many supplies as possible, the whole thing with getting everyone out happens, ultimately leading to Doug or Carly's death. They then get away to the boarding school. With all the medical supplies they have, Miss Martin and the kids would praise the gang as heroes for risking their lives to help them out. After hearing the drugstore was overrun, they would invite them to stay, and the gang would agree. I think we'd get a cute scene where Lee would encourage Clementine to go make some friends. She'd be very nervous meeting Lewis, Violet, Minerva, and Sophie, as well as a few miscellaneous kids. While at first she'd be nervous, she quickly warms up to them though. Doc would then run over and pulls a funny face, making everyone laugh, which would make Lee smile seeing Clementine having fun. In the time skip between episodes 1 and 2, we'd get some off-screen character development. The kids would all warm up to different people trying to become more like them. For example, Marlon and Minerva would take a liking to Lily and begin taking notes how she handles things. On the flip side, Lily would be helping taking care of Ten and Willie, making them like her even more. Mitch would probably like Larry despite Larry hating all the kids, so there is that. Karcher would take a liking to Rosie, the dog, as she's a vet and would like how well behaved the mutt is. She'd probably teach Duck a couple things about how to look after animals. He'd take to this lessons like a duck to water. Lewis would get some kind of respect for Kenny and would constantly hang around him, trying to learn from him. The duo would have a good back and forth, with Lewis constantly quipping and Kenny getting fed up. Violet would also have a respect for Kenny though, and she doesn't verbalize it and isn't as up close and personal with Kenny about it. As Sim would respect Mark for his services and would try to help him out around the place. While Mark doesn't really teach a Sim anything, it'd be cool to see their interactions. With a much bigger group than just Miss Martin, a woman who isn't used to conflict, to be able to clear out the greenhouse when the occasional walker gets in, meaning the walkers don't overrun it and Miss Martin survives. They begin growing food and see some decent results. Due to the amount of food they would need, and since it will take a good while for the greenhouse to be fully self-sustaining, the gang would have different traps around the place to hunt and get food. They would have things like rope traps all set up, which means they don't need as much manpower to capture animals. Lee would see this as a good time to give the kids some practice of the real world, and so when we pick up with him in episode 2, he'd be out there with Clementine, Lewis, Asim, Violet, and Brody. They'd be helping Lee with traps and talking with Lee where they'd be asking him trivial questions about himself. That's when they would hear a scream. Lee tells the kids to go back to the school, but only Asim and Brody would be okay with this. And since it might be dangerous for only them to head back, they stick with Lee as he heads over, finding Mr. Parker's leg caught in the bear trap. Here, Lee won't have his axe, so he can't cut off his leg, meaning they have to leave him no matter what. Travis would get annoyed by this and tries to take one of Lee's arrows from him to use it to pick the lock, leading to him accidentally getting stabbed. Everyone would then leave back to the school holding Travis, taking Ben with them in the process. When they return, Miss Martin and Cartio would be doing their best to patch him up, with Ruby watching and taking notes. Lily would tell Lee that he can't bring more people back when they're struggling to take care of all the people they have already, but Kenny would then defend Lee, and Lily gives Lee the mini game to hand out food. Here though, Lee would have more food to hand out due to there being more food to give out, as well as there being more mouths to feed. Lee would be able to interact with a variety of children at this point. If you look at Ruby, Lee would comment about how she looks so calm, however he won't get the option to talk to her. Instead, Asim will warn him that the only time she's calm is when watching Miss Martin work. It's best to leave her. Talking to Asim can lead to Lee learning about why he was sent there, which should be due to him being a reformed arsonist. Asim can also express his frustrations to Lee about how his thoughts are out of control, asking Lee what he should do. Lee would then give him the idea of making a journal, which Asim would find an intriguing idea. Talking to Omar would lead to Lee learning about his passion for making good meals. Trying to give him food would lead to him refusing it due to pride. Talking to Brody will lead to Lee learning about how she wants to go somewhere and relax, asking Lee where he to go, giving him a variety of options. Talking to Minerva and Sophie will lead to Lee learning about how they're worried about looking after 10. Lee can also learn about their parents, why they were sent to school, and what they're interested in. Trying to feed them will lead to them giving the food to 10 instead. Talking to Marlon can lead to Lee noticing how he's much more mature than the majority of the kids there, which makes Marlon smile a bit embarrassed. He can also talk about how he's been practicing with a bow and arrow, which Lee would find cool. Trying to give Marlon food will lead to him giving it to Ben. If Ben already ate, then he'll give it to Lewis, and if Lewis already ate, he'll give it to Violet. If they all ate, then he'll eat it himself. Talking to Lewis can lead to Lee learning about his love for music. Lee can also learn about how Lewis feels after seeing Travis get stabbed, with him being rather uneasy around all that violent stuff. Lee can also talk about Lewis and Clementine's friendship. Talking to Violet leads to Lee learning about how she is rather annoyed at Travis' stupidity for getting stabbed. Lee can also learn about how Violet is good friends with most of the girls, especially with Minerva in particular. Like in canon, Travis becomes a walker and is then put down. The St. John's then show up and would ask for gas in exchange for food. Here though, the gang would be a lot more hesitant to accept the offer. The St. John's would need enough food to feed a large majority of the people they have at the school, a thing that is rather unlikely for them to have. The St. John's would explain that they can maybe feed 10 mouths at a push, but not all this, so they'd merely leave not having a deal, which means that Larry and Mark would survive, for the time being. The gang would continue like this, doing quite good in this time. Or maybe one or two children get killed by walkers, the gang is able to keep the school functioning to a decent degree. Lee, Mark and Kenny would make the trip to the drugstore, where they'd have typical dialogue as you can expect. Mark would vote to put the girl out of her misery, but it's ultimately Lee's choice. They then make it to the drugstore and begin to get supplies before escaping. When making it back, Larry would be much more violent towards Lee depending on what he brings back. Lily would also be much more stable during this time as her father hasn't been killed by a Solik. Her and Kenny still argue and Lily ultimately tells everyone to leave except for Lee. She confesses about stolen supplies and tasks Lee to go figure out who stole the supplies. Lee would head out to look, but instead of getting help from Doug, he'd get help from Midge. They'd find the broken flashlight and ultimately they'll find the stolen supplies, where Lee brings it back to Lily. The raiders will then notice that the supplies are gone, but notice the vast group until they decide not to attack. Initially. This is where we're going to leave things for right now, however. And yeah, so let me know if you liked this part. If you did, give it a like, as it does support the channel. If you want a part 2, also likes, just, contribute to that. Let me know what you think can happen in part 2, by the way. With the raiders and Promise coming back, as well as the St. John's being alive, we're going to get a much bigger raid than the one we did in canon. So who do you think will survive that? And yeah, bye!